I'm here tonight to suggest very, very strongly that many of the illnesses that afflict us today in ever-growing numbers and severity were hatched in biological warfare laboratories and have now escaped, whether intentionally or accidentally, and are now among us today.
Never stop to wonder when watching my TV why we who do the work so seldom see. Now I'm wondering why we're blacked out or portrayed as troublemakers, or always in the background when on screen. Working TV, now we're on screen. Working TV.
Welcome to Working TV. I'm Libby Davies. If you believed that aircraft with secret government approval have been spraying noxious chemicals developed in U.S. military biological warfare laboratories on unsuspecting Canadians, would you be paranoid? Or if you yourself saw distinct plumes of Chem Trails from this spraying, yet were told by Transport Canada that no such spraying was taking place, would you be delusional? You'd be absolutely correct, according to William Thomas, who has spent the last 14 months studying the chemtrails phenomenon. He's an award-winning journalist who recently wrote a book about the Gulf War syndrome. This is the strange cluster of illnesses all linked to a deterioration of the autoimmune system suffered by troops who received anthrax immunization before being deployed in the Gulf War. It's a lot like the chemtrail syndrome. Perhaps Thomas is a fraud. Perhaps his photographs and videotape evidence are all fakes. We don't know for sure, and the mainstream media won't touch his story. Nevertheless, we're told that Project Censored USA, a respected media watchdog group, recently judged chemtrails to be one of the most underreported stories of the past year. So you be the judge. Here now is William Thomas on chemtrails.
My story really began on the battlefield of Kuwait, just after the Gulf War, just after liberation, when I entered that town and joined up with two other gentlemen in a Gulf Environmental Emergency Response team. And the three of us were the sole response to the biggest environmental disaster of modern time, including an oil slick 25 times bigger than Exxon Valdez, a slick that was later doubled in size by the oil rain falling out of that sky. We didn't see the sun our entire time in Kuwait. I was focused on the environmental aspects of that war, but when I came home from that conflict, I was very ill for a year. I had no functioning immune system. I would get the flu and it would linger for months and months and then return. And through a program of superb vitamin supplementation, Dr. Madsen here in this town, I was able to regain my health and my immune system. And when I heard from hundreds and hundreds of veterans about a strange illness they were calling Gulf War syndrome, I became very concerned as a journalist that, again, this was not being covered by the mainstream press. And in 12 months of going every news source from Rolling Stone and Mother Jones to the New York Times, I was turned down everywhere because the story was simply too hot. That story on Gulf War illness was eventually published by Monday Magazine in Victoria, and I went on to write a book called Bringing the War Home. And in that book I was able to show a photograph of a very tiny critter about the tenth of the size of bacteria called a mycoplasma, which Dr. Garth Nicholson and his wife Nancy, foremost microbiologists with reputations highly regarded throughout the world in their profession, had tracked Gulf War illness to this mycoplasma in the anthrax vaccines given to Canadian, American, Australian, and British soldiers. Many of them got sick even though they never deployed to the Gulf. And I concluded the book by saying the only good news is, with some 200,000 sick veterans in North America and their spouses and their children, at least radioactive mycoplasma and these biological weapons are not loose among the public. I was wrong. So tonight we're going to have a look at what is really ailing us. We're going to have a look at what is happening in the skies overhead, and we're going to talk about what we can do about that. In January 1999, I got a phone call from the managing editor of the Environment News Service, whom I worked for in the Gulf, and he said, please check out a story of a man named William Wallace, just over the border in Washington State, who lives in eastern Washington, very remote region. He lives in a cabin with his wife. And Mr. Wallace has been talking about large airplanes overflying his house back and forth, spraying plumes that look like contrails, the condensation trails we're all used to seeing. But unlike these ice crystal trails that form in the hot engines of jet aircraft above 33,000 feet, according to the U.S. military and Canadian aviation authorities, unlike these condensation trails that linger usually, not always, but almost always, for about 30 to 45 seconds. You see the pencil-thin trail a short distance behind the aircraft, disappearing like the wake behind a boat. Unlike these trails, the trails that William Wallace and his wife Anne were seeing were broad white plumes. They lingered for hours. And as these aircraft began crisscrossing each other and forming a grid, these plumes gathered together and took a clear blue sky and made it opaque, hazy, milky. Temperatures dropped. His animals sickened, his dogs died, his plants sickened, his wife became very ill. And when I went on Art Bell for the first time and used William Wallace's name with his permission, he was again visited for the third time by aircraft who sprayed their property. In fact, that night when I finished my first Art Bell show, I was living in a small cabin in the hills outside of Chemainus. And I came outside about 3:30 in the morning, very wired from this very intense presentation. Took a breath of air, beautiful night, stars, just started to relax, and I froze. Giant X right over the cabin. Now, I'm not paranoid or anything, but when they started flying parallel patterns down the ridge right across from me over the next few weeks, I began to wonder. If maybe some people were sensitive about having this story exposed. Let's have a quick look at what we're talking about, because pictures are always better than words. I don't know about you, but people continually tell me, oh, these are normal contrails, these are normal aircraft patterns, and I'm here to tell you tonight that if commercial airline pilots pulled this stunt, they would lose their license. These pictures were taken very recently over Nevada, Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, an international flight center, and towards the end, Vancouver on Monday of this week. Legal spacing for commercial airliners is 3 miles. I believe the X's are for satellite identification. Don't worry, it's just normal airline traffic. And if you wait a few minutes, you'll watch and see these Chem Trails start to spread out as they're doing here. And if you have ignored the phenomena for an hour and happen to look up, you'll probably think it's just cloud. But fog forms at ground level. It doesn't form at 20,000 feet. But something else was going on. Something else down here on the ground. Last winter, in this city, in Victoria, in London, Ontario, in Toronto, Edmonton, cities across Canada, we saw an epidemic of influenza-like illnesses. That epidemic was also right across the United States and England. At Peterborough, the emergency room took 307 acute care patients in one day.